You want more. More freedom, more money, more control over your life. You imagine a bigger version of your future, a life where your time is yours, where your decisions actually matter, where you wake up and feel like you are moving, not just existing. So why does it still feel like you're moving in circles? Why do so many people feel like they're capable of more, but somehow never actually get there? What if the problem isn't your discipline? What if the problem isn't motivation? What if the real reason is something much deeper? What if your life is designed to keep you small? Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally. Most people believe they are free because they can make choices. They can choose a job, choose a career, choose where to live, choose what to buy. But there is something strange about those choices. Most of them exist inside a very narrow range. You can choose which job, but you are expected to have one. You can choose which path, but not whether to leave the path entirely. You can choose how you spend your weekends, but not whether the system that consumes your weekdays makes sense. The range feels wide enough that it passes as freedom, but look closer and you start to see the walls. From a very young age, you were trained to operate inside structures. School didn't reward curiosity, it rewarded compliance. You were taught to follow instructions, complete assignments, memorize information, and move forward in predictable steps. Sit down, be quiet, do the work, wait for the bell. And slowly, without realizing it, you learned something much deeper than math or language. You learned how to function inside a system. You learn that reward comes from following the rules, that safety comes from staying in your lane, that the right answer is usually the expected one. After school comes work, and the rules barely change. Follow instructions, meet expectations, stay inside the structure, wait for promotion, wait for recognition, wait for permission. The system does not reward expansion. It rewards predictability. Predictable employees, predictable behavior, predictable outcomes. Because predictability makes systems stable, and stability makes systems efficient. But efficiency for the system does not always mean expansion for the individual. Now add another layer: social pressure. People like stability. Families like stability. Society praises stability. A stable job, a stable income, a stable life. The moment you step outside that pattern, something interesting happens. People become uncomfortable. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something unfamiliar. Deviation creates anxiety. Standing out creates questions, and questions create doubt. So most people learn very quickly that it's easier to stay inside the boundaries, not because they lack ambition, but because the cost of deviation feels socially expensive. You lose the comfort of belonging. You risk being misunderstood. You trade certainty for possibility, and most people aren't ready for that trade. But there's another force that's even more powerful: comfort. Modern life is engineered for comfort: predictable routines, predictable income, predictable environments. And your brain loves predictability because predictability lowers stress. When things are stable, your nervous system relaxes. When your nervous system relaxes, your brain releases reward signals. Over time, stability becomes more than a condition. It becomes a habit, then identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who plays it safe, someone who thinks carefully, someone who avoids unnecessary risk. On the surface, this looks intelligent, responsible, strategic, but underneath it, something else is happening. Your tolerance for uncertainty is shrinking, and uncertainty
is where expansion lives.
Your brain doesn't measure success the same way you do. You think about potential. Your brain thinks about survival. And for most of human history, instability meant danger. Unpredictable environments meant threats. Your brain evolved to avoid volatility, which creates a strange contradiction. The life you want often requires instability, starting something new, taking risks, leaving predictable structures. But the brain you inherited is wired to avoid those exact conditions. So when you feel resistance, it's not necessarily laziness. It's not weakness. It's not a character flaw. It's your biology doing its job, protecting you from uncertainty. Now combine all of these forces together: structured systems, social pressure, biological risk avoidance, comfort-based environments, and the result is something powerful, a life that slowly narrows your range. Most people don't suddenly decide to live small. They drift into it. A safe job becomes a routine becomes identity, and identity becomes limitation. Years pass, and everything still looks stable from the outside. The job is stable, the income is stable, the routine is stable. But internally, something is shrinking. Your tolerance for uncertainty, your willingness to take risks, your ability to move forward without guarantees. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. Your life doesn't need to collapse for it to become small. It only needs to become predictable. Predictability quietly removes possibility, because the more predictable your environment becomes, the less space there is for expansion. Most people believe growth requires motivation, but motivation is unreliable. Motivation comes and goes. What actually determines growth is something else entirely: your tolerance for instability, your ability to function when things are uncertain, your ability to move forward without guarantees. And this is where most people struggle, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack ambition, but because they have trained themselves over years, over decades, to seek stability first and expansion second, which means expansion rarely happens. Now here is the uncomfortable truth. The system you live in does not necessarily want you to expand endlessly. It wants you to function. It wants you to contribute. It wants you to remain predictable. Predictable systems are easier to manage. Predictable people are easier to organize. Predictable behavior keeps everything running smoothly. But your potential does not live inside smooth systems. It lives outside predictable boundaries, which means growth often requires stepping outside structures that feel safe, not recklessly, not irresponsibly, but consciously. You start questioning assumptions. You test the limits of what feels possible. You increase your tolerance for uncertainty. And slowly, your range begins to expand again. Not because the system changed, but because your relationship with it changed. You stopped assuming the boundaries were permanent and started treating them as negotiable. The most important shift isn't external, it's psychological. You stop asking what feels safe and start asking what expands your capacity. What challenges your assumptions, what forces you to adapt, what pulls you toward the edge of what you thought was possible. Because the moment you start expanding your tolerance for instability, your life begins to expand with it, not instantly, but gradually.
6 months from now, your life could look completely different. Not because you discovered a secret, not because luck suddenly appeared, but because you stopped shrinking your world to match your comfort zone and started expanding your comfort zone to match your potential. The real question was never whether you wanted more. Of course you want more. Freedom, more control, more possibility. The real question is something much deeper. How much uncertainty are you willing to tolerate? Because the moment you become comfortable with instability, the system stops defining your limits, and you start defining them yourself. And that is the moment your life stops being designed to keep you small and starts becoming something you design.